Hey, what's up guys, Sukhdeep here. Today I wanted to answer the question of, should you get a MacBook or an iPad? Can the iPad be your main computer? And I think that in 2024, for a lot of people, yes, it can be. But there are caveats, and given the amount of money that these things cost, it's not a decision you'll want to make lightly. So in this video, I'll be comparing the two devices from the perspective of somebody who's been using the iPad since 2012, and I'll explain why even though the iPad can technically replace your computer, if I could only pick one, I would actually opt for the MacBook instead. Okay, so let's touch quickly on pricing since this is probably the reason why you're choosing between the MacBook and the iPad instead of getting both. So currently you can pick up the 13-inch M2 MacBook Air for just $999 or the M3 MacBook Air for $1099. And with both MacBook models, you'll get a keyboard and a trackpad included. With the iPad, however, if you want it to be a viable laptop replacement, you're probably going to want two things. Firstly, you're going to want to get the 13-inch model if this is going to be your only computer, simply because I feel like 11 inches just isn't enough screen real estate to multitask with, and the 13-inch iPad Air starts off at $799, whilst the 13-inch iPad Pro starts off at $1299. But then you're also going to have to purchase the keyboard separately, and if you want the best, most MacBook-like typing experience possible, you're probably going to want to pick up Apple's first-party Magic Keyboard case, which costs an additional $349, bringing the total cost of the iPad Air setup to $1,148 and the Pro setup to $1,548. And so just by this calculus alone, the iPad setup is costing more than what an actual laptop that runs an actual laptop operating system would cost you. And this is before we've even added in the other accessories like the Apple Pencil. And unless money is no object to you, in which case you probably wouldn't be watching this video, there's arguably no way in which you can justify spending more money for a seemingly less capable device. Okay, so you've just heard me tear down the iPad's existence to shreds. So you might be wondering, why on earth would anybody ever purchase an iPad over a MacBook then? And there are really three big reasons that I can think of. Firstly, you get support for the Apple Pencil, which unlocks a host of new experiences that the Mac is simply not capable of. It makes marking up PDFs so much easier. It makes editing photos in Adobe Lightroom much more pleasant. In fact, it's probably the reason why most students opt for the iPad in the first place, because why carry a ring binder full of lecture notes when you can access and annotate all of them digitally in such a slim device? And secondly, there are quite a lot of apps which work very well on the iPad, but which don't work so well on the Mac. For example, Google Docs and Netflix are only available as web apps on the Mac, which means you can't download any content from them like you can on the iPad. When it comes to stuff like booking hotels using booking.com, I personally prefer doing tasks like that on the iPad where there's a dedicated app, rather than having to log into their website on the Mac. It just feels a lot more trustworthy when I'm interacting from an app from the App Store that I know that Apple have approved of, compared to when I'm just scrolling through a random website, which half of the time doesn't even work properly. And finally, and most importantly, I think that there's a fun factor involved when you use an iPad. If you just look at the way that apps animate when you open and close them, everything just looks a lot nicer and simpler compared to on the Mac. Just look at this Apple Music app on the Mac and compare it to the iPad. And there's an argument to be made that the more fun a computer is to use, the more likely you are to sit down and get work done on that computer. Especially because with an iPad, you can even get a cellular option, so you can theoretically get work done from anywhere across the world. That said, I have a feeling that if the iPad is the only computer that you own, there will probably come a point within the next few years where you'll wish you had access to a proper desktop, because there are just some simple tasks that you cannot do on an iPad. If you want to scroll through Twitter whilst listening to music, you can only do that on the Mac because the iPad currently doesn't support multiple streams of audio. If you want to import the contents of a PDF into Notion or resize an image, you can't do that on the iPad. If you want to zoom in on text on the Notes app, you can't do that on the iPad. If you're on a Teams call and you want to refer to multiple Word and PowerPoint documents, to be fair, you can sort of do this on the iPad using Stage Manager, but you're limited to just 4 windows in your stage. And there's no real mission control alternative, which lets you easily preview and select windows in that space. And you might argue that these are all contrived examples, but chances are you'll probably encounter similar missing features with the apps that you use at some point. So really it is software that is holding the iPad back, because I think that the iPad Pro has the best hardware of any mainstream Apple product right now. It has the M4 chip, it has an OLED display, In many ways, the hardware is superior to the MacBooks, but the software is lacking somewhat. Now, I'm not saying that Apple needs to import macOS onto the iPad, because I feel like forcing an OS that hasn't been optimized for touch could potentially ruin the tablet experience and the fun factor that makes iPadOS special. But the software on the iPad does need to catch up somehow. Also, let's not forget about the fact that the iPad only gives you around 10 hours of battery life, so you'll usually need to charge it at least once during the day, whereas the MacBook Air comes with around 15 hours, and it can often last multiple days on end. Now, I can imagine that there will be some people saying, Sukhdeep, I'm a basic user, I just need an iPad to browse the web, take notes, reply to emails, and to watch and like your YouTube videos on. Like, I don't really need a power user setup. I know plenty of people who just need an iPad for basic tasks. Even Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, apparently uses an iPad as his main computer. And I can totally see why those sorts of users might gravitate towards the iPad, especially the iPad Air now that it's available in that larger size. So it really does depend on your use case, as annoying as that is to hear. But the way I'd see it is that the MacBook is the much safer platform. It does what you need it to do. There aren't many software updates you get nowadays, simply because the platform is so mature, whereas the iPad is the more exciting platform, which Apple is constantly innovating on with things like Stage Manager, Apple Pencil support. But it's a lot riskier because I feel like Apple are sort of trying to reinvent the whole computer experience here, which for a younger generation that's grown up on touchscreens, that's fine. But if you're used to that more traditional desktop sort of experience, I can understand why using the iPad might feel a bit weird and less efficient than working on a Mac. So, which one do I recommend? Well, I'm going to split my answer into two cases. So, case one is if you're a power user who has a lot of windows across multiple apps open all at once on their computer. Realistically, the iPad, just isn't going to cut it, and there probably will come a point where you'll need to have access to a desktop of some sorts. And to be fair, it doesn't have to be a MacBook. It could be a Windows laptop or a PC at your local library, but I would seriously recommend that you at least have access to a proper desktop somewhere. But then there's the second case where, you're not a power user. Let's say you're an office worker in a corporation. Chances are your employer is probably going to provide you with a laptop for all of your main working needs. And so you just need something that you can use as sort of a couch computer when you're at home or on holiday to quickly reply to emails or touch up that quick PowerPoint document. And I feel like those sorts of users could probably get away with using the iPad as their main computer. In fact, I know plenty of people who use their company laptop for all of their heavy duty work and then an iPad to manage all of their personal computing needs because it's just a lot more approachable and fun to use an iPad. But it's also very expensive. Like spending $1,000 for a couch computer sort of seems like a bit of a luxury. And if you can afford a luxury like that, then I might have a better alternative because you can actually purchase the 10th generation base model iPad for around $349 now. You can also get a refurbished M1 MacBook Air for less than $799. And with that setup, you've got an iPad and a MacBook that costs under $1,148, which you'll notice is the exact same cost of the iPad Air setup we saw earlier. And then you can also throw in an Apple Pencil with USB-C for $79 as well. And so with this setup, you can have the capability of the Mac combined with the versatility that the iPad gives you with its touchscreen and Apple Pencil support. Sure, you don't get the keyboard on the iPad with this budget, but you have the Mac for that. So you effectively have the best of both worlds. Of course, this is just one recommendation, and with it costing over $1,000, I don't really know if I can call it a budget option, but I'd argue it's a more cost-effective option than simply getting the 13-inch iPad Air or iPad Pro with the Magic Keyboard. And of course, this is based on my own personal experience. For me personally, the iPad isn't my main computer. I use it just to consume content, to read books, maybe editing photos whilst I'm watching TV on the sofa. And then when it comes to getting heavy-duty work done, I'll turn to my Mac. The way I see it is the iPad is a complement to the Mac, not a replacement. And I think the only reason we're having this whole iPad versus MacBook debate is because Apple, for better or for worse, have priced these devices at similar levels, which is giving people the impression that they're substitutes when in fact they're not. The iPad is a tablet and the MacBook is a laptop. And yes, there is going to be some overlap between them in the same way that there's an overlap between, a luxury sedan and a high-performance sports car. But ultimately, the intended use cases are going to be slightly different. But the beautiful thing about tech is that so many of you have your own unique use cases for the iPad, and I'd love to hear more about those use cases in the comments down below. Consider leaving a like if you found this video helpful and subscribe for the next one.